It's a nightmare situation.
A pilot is asleep and hurtles the plane into the ground, killing most of the passengers. It's just unbelievable. It went down. I can't even imagine.
In a world where air traffic is increasing,
sometimes 8, 10, 12 flights a day, it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work. It almost begs you to be tired.
The danger of pilot fatigue is a terrifying reality. All too often, highly experienced pilots have dropped the ball.
We'd lock them up if they were driving a car, but an aeroplane, that's fine.
Pilot fatigue is a problem the industry has taken decades to wake up to, and the consequences have been catastrophic. Liberty International Airport. 45 passengers aboarding Colgan Air Flight 3407 to Buffalo, New York. Among them is 57-year-old widow Beverly Eckert, who lost her husband in the 9/11 attacks.
Beverly met her husband Sean when they were just 16 years old. It was at a high school dance. They were so in love. I mean, from the time they were 16 till the day he died.
Tonight, Beverly is traveling home to Buffalo, where she and Sean met.
We were always excited when Beverly came home. We were just looking forward to it.
It's been a blustery night on the East Coast, and the flight has already been delayed by the weather for over 2 hours. Still waiting to board the plane is 27-year-old John Perry. He's arranged to meet someone special at the airport.
John had flown from Amsterdam. He landed in Newark. My dad was actually talking to John as he was waiting for Nicole to arrive. The last thing that John had said to him was, "Okay, I see Nicole coming, I've got to go."
John and girlfriend Nicole have continued a long-distance relationship since his move to Europe for work.
Jonathan and Nicole hadn't seen each other for probably 2 to 3 weeks. They wanted to come to Buffalo on Valentine's Day weekend. They were going to see Nicole's family and go skiing that weekend.
There's an especially important reason for the trip.
We knew that they were going to live the rest of their lives together. And we were absolutely ready and wanting to bring her into our family even more than she already was.
Folks from the flight deck, we're still about number 10 for departure and should be airborne just shortly. So please make sure your seatbelts are fastened tight. Thanks.
Flying the plane will be 24-year-old First Officer Rebecca Shaw and 47-year-old Captain Marvin Renslow. They're flying a turboprop Dash 8 Q400, a workhorse of a demanding regional industry.
Flying for a regional airline like Colgan, it's challenging work. Flying the turboprops, which generally stay down low, you're in the weather, you're not above the weather, you're dodging thunderstorms, a lot of takeoffs and landings. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of work.
9:20 p.m. After lengthy delays, Colgan Flight 3407 finally gets clearance for takeoff.
Power checked, 80 knots. 80. V1, rotate.
It was just another flight. It was just another evening going from Newark, New Jersey to Buffalo, New York.
Flight 3407 continues through the cold skies of upstate New York towards Buffalo. As they near their destination, the crew receive contact from Buffalo Air Traffic Control to prepare for landing.
Colgan 3407, descend and maintain 4000.
Ladies and gentlemen, in preparation for landing in Buffalo, please be certain your seat back is straight up and your seat belts are fastened.
Since her husband's death in the 9/11 attacks, Beverly Eckert has campaigned tirelessly for changes to air safety.
She focused on the breakdown in the intelligence. Why wasn't security stronger? How did these people get on these airlines? She wanted the U.S. government to find out what went wrong.
John thought nothing of flying. He enjoyed the travel, he enjoyed the experience of being able to get to a different place. It was a trusted way to travel.
So they're starting their descent into Buffalo on this routine night in a routine flight. Everything seemed to be normal.
And that's another thing he said. Oh yeah, in 6 months' time you'll be upgraded into the Saab and blah, blah, blah.
The atmosphere remains relaxed as the plane gets closer to Buffalo. Landing preparations begin.
Gears down.
Flaps 15 for landing checklist.
But there's a problem.
That stick shaker is there to tell you the airplane is stalling.
Jesus Christ!
The plane's speed has dropped to a critically low level. It's now dangerously unstable.
When it loses complete aerodynamic lift, it will fall out of the sky. It rolled, it yawed, it went left, it went right, just giving a nightmarish ride to those poor passengers.
The pilots fight to keep the plane in the air.
Wing flaps up, shoot the gear up. Shoot the gear up.
But it's too late.
It just started losing altitude very rapidly.
The plane stalls and falls from the sky. What was a perfectly normal flight is now doomed.
I know she would have been concerned about all of us, waiting for her, because she knows what would happen. I'm hoping she thought that somehow that plane could come out of the stall, because it went up and down. I can't even imagine.
Flight 3407 crashes into a quiet suburb of Buffalo, killing all 49 people on board and 1 on the ground. It's the worst US air disaster in over 7 years, and no one knows what caused it. Among those lost are Jonathan Perry and his long-term girlfriend Nicole Korchikowski.
I was getting ready for work on Friday morning on the 13th, and my father had text messaged me. It was a short message, and it just said, "Phone home now." That morning, my life changed.
Also lost in the crash is 57-year-old Beverly Eckert, a woman already widowed by disaster, having lost her husband in the 9/11 attacks.
The news was reporting a small plane has crashed in Clarence. And all of a sudden, they said it was a commercial airline from Newark. And I just screamed.
Officials at the National Transportation Safety Board in Washington, D.C. must find out what has caused the accident. Tom Howell Houter, a man with over 25 years' experience in air crashes, takes charge.
We formed a team. We immediately sent them up to Buffalo, started collecting data, started examining all the flight crew records, all the maintenance records on the aircraft, and collect as much information as possible. But what we do is get the flight data recorder, cockpit voice recorder back here, and then start working the data.
The precious data recorders from Flight 3407 are recovered from the crash site. They may hold vital clues to what went wrong.
Put the wing flaps up, shoot the gear up.
Taking a look at the cockpit voice recorder tapes, we knew that early on, and we could see both in the flight data recorder information and from what the crew said, that the aircraft had encountered ice during the flight.
In freezing temperatures, ice can build up on the wings of an aircraft, changing their shape and reducing their lift as they cut through the air. So in order to counter the reduced lift and avoid a stall, the aircraft must fly faster than it normally would. To remind the pilots to fly faster, the Dash 8 is fitted with a sophisticated speed reference system that takes account of the effects of ice. The red zone on the display indicates a dangerously low speed. So were the pilots flying fast enough to be out of the red?
Looking at the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder, the airplane got it slower.
Another thing he said, oh yeah, in 6 months' time you'll be upgraded into the sub and blah, blah, blah. I'm like thinking...
While the pilots were chatting, the plane was slipping further and further into the red.
They didn't pay attention to the speed reference. They were distracted with other things.
I'm like thinking, you know...
Renslow and Shaw had broken a crucial safety regulation.
In the Northeast, I have 1,600 hours, so...
They were not abiding by the sterile cockpit rule. Below 10,000 feet, the crew should maintain conversation only pertinent to the flight. They were not abiding by the rule and not fully focused on the flight itself.
For Tom Houter, this seemingly innocuous chit-chat is disturbingly familiar. An earlier disaster still haunts him, but it might provide a clue.
No call, sir.
48-year-old Captain Kim Sass is preparing for another day in the air.
The crew got up in the dark very, very early in the morning to start an early shift.
Captain Sass's co-pilot is 29-year-old Jonathan Palmer. They work for Corporate Airlines, a regional operator in the Midwest that requires its pilots to complete a high number of fast turnaround flights in a single day. Today, October the 19th, 2004, Sass and Palmer are scheduled to complete 8 flights. The crew are flying a Jetstream 32 twin turboprop, a small short-haul commuting aircraft. Their first journey is from Burlington to St. Louis. Their next flight to Quincy is cancelled because of bad weather. But they're soon back in the air from St. Louis to Kirksville. Kirksville back to St. Louis. St. Louis back to Burlington. Burlington back to St. Louis. And their final journey of the day is from St. Louis back to Kirksville. This is Corporate Airlines Flight 5966.
All I can think about is a Philly cheesesteak and an iced tea.
Sounds good.
There are 13 passengers on board Flight 5966, most of whom are medical professionals traveling to a conference. Among them is 69-year-old Dr. John Krogh.
The people on this flight knew each other, had been to these meetings before, and were very happy to see each other. I was accompanied by my secretary, Wendy Bonham. Wendy was actually a friend as well as a colleague. We were all pretty relaxed.
As Flight 5966 travels through the dark skies of the Midwest towards its destination. The crew receive an automated weather report from Kirksville.
Kirksville, automated weather observation. Wind 050660.
There's thick, low-lying cloud.
We're not getting in. I know. Go all this friggin' way.
The pilots will now have to attempt a landing in almost zero visibility. If they get to a point where they still can't see the ground, they'll have to turn back.
That sucks. It does suck. Well, let's try it. Yeah, we'll try it.
It's going to be the most challenging landing of their long day in the air. Flight 5966 begins its descent.
So eerie and creepy. I get a suffocating feeling when I see that. I'm drowning.
As the plane continues its descent through thick cloud, Sass and Palmer are beginning to realize just how difficult a task they've taken on. They're approaching a critical point.
1320. What do you think? I can't see the ground there.
Minimums.
I can't see anything.
They've reached their minimum descent altitude. It's the lowest they're allowed to go when they can't see the ground. Any lower, and they risk hitting something. They decide to continue. It's a decision that has jeopardized the lives of the passengers. But they remain oblivious.
My thoughts were pleasant thoughts of greeting my daughter and her children who were waiting for me there. Just a pleasant anticipation of a reunion with my family.
Flight 5966 is now only a few hundred feet above the ground, but the pilots still can't see anything. What's more, they're about to make another critical mistake.
We get rid of the direction.
They switch off the system, warning them of their dangerously low altitude.
Their reaction to that was just, shut up, we know we're getting closer to the ground. So they ignored it.
Sass and Palmer are now dicing with death.
Getting a little slow. Flat 35? No.
Sink rate.
No, trees!
Pull
no!
up.
Oh, God, no!
Corporate Airlines Flight 5966 has crashed into woodland outside Kirksville, Missouri, killing 13 of the 15 people on board. Miraculously, 69-year-old Dr. John Krogh has survived.
The heat was just intense. And then alongside of me was another person. I didn't know for sure who it was. I asked, would that person next to me perhaps be Wendy? And they said, yes, that's Wendy. And I was very happy to hear that. But there were only two of us. All of the others, the pilot, the co-pilot, were all gone. I've often asked myself, why did I survive? I was the oldest passenger on that plane. I was 69 years old.
Once more, it's the job of the National Transportation Safety Board in Washington, D.C. to find out what has caused the disaster. Lead investigator Tom Houter is in charge.
Once again, I'm head of aviation safety, so all the investigators work for me. We put together an investigative team to go out to Kirksville.
Investigators scour the smoldering wreckage for the flight data recorders. They contain vital clues to the accident.
When I first listened to the cockpit voice recorder, I was wondering what was going on with this flight crew, because the discussion and behavior was very different than what I normally hear on cockpit voice recorder tapes.
So eerie and creepy. I get a suffocating feeling when I see that. I'm drowning.
Not only is the pilot's behavior unusual, it's in breach of that crucial safety regulation, the sterile cockpit rule.
Below 10,000 feet, they were not maintaining the standards you expect. They should be focused on the approach itself.
Captain Sass and First Officer Palmer had made the same critical mistake as the pilots of Colgan Flight 3407 were to make 4.5 years later. They lost focus during a crucial stage of their flight. And they paid the same price.
Breaking the rules was a risk, and it was a risk which killed them. They knew that it could kill them, but they did it anyway. So, why?
Altimeters are 29990.
Set and cross-check.
The investigation quickly shifts focus to the pilots. Who were they? And why had they made these suicidal decisions?
I can't see anything.
Kauta calls on human performance investigator Malcolm Brenner to find the answers.
The corporate airlines flight that we're discussing, for me, was extreme compared to others. We're trying to understand, is there something about that particular day that they're not up to their normal game?
Brenner's detective work begins.
We did interviews and checked background evidence related to the pilots, their training, their schedules. Looking at these pilots, there is nothing out of the ordinary about their backgrounds. Both were qualified for the flight, both had FAA records with no violations.
All I can think about is a Philly cheesesteak and a nice tea.
When I listen to the voice recording, the crew's tone and discussion is informal to a degree that I found disturbing.
Made you wonder for a moment, this crew having some issue with lack of oxygen or under the influence of something, because their behavior just sounded very different than what you normally hear on the cockpit voice recorder.
So were the pilots under the influence of some kind of intoxicant?
There were toxicology tests performed on both pilots, and both of them were negative for drugs of abuse and for major prescription medication. We realized that drugs were not an issue.
So how could their bizarre behavior be explained? Brenner retraces the pilots' footsteps in the days leading up to their fateful flight.
This was a 4-day schedule. They flew in on Sunday morning and then flew that afternoon.
Sass and Palmer spend 2 days on duty flying across the Midwest. But the third day is the toughest. This is October the 19th, the day of the crash.
Typically, on these schedules, there would be at least one very difficult and challenging day.
The pilots were scheduled for 8 flights.
We know in the hotel, the captain had a wake-up call at 4:10 in the morning. First officer had a wake-up call at 4:30 in the morning. So they're starting at an early hour, and they have a long day ahead.
By the time of Flight 5966, the last of the day, Sass and Palmer were on their 14th hour on duty.
All I can think about is a Philly cheesesteak and a nice tea.
Sounds good.
With all the evidence in front of him, Brenner can draw only one conclusion.
Fatigue likely degraded the decision-making and the performance of these pilots in a way that contributed to this accident.
It was beyond doubt that having been awake for over 16 hours at the time of the crash, Sass and Palmer were effectively intoxicated by fatigue. They were in no fit state to be working, let alone flying an aircraft with 13 lives in their hands.
The fact that I lost some very dear friends as a result of some pilots that were allowed to work excessively long is a very sad thing to me. I was really shocked that the company had allowed them to do that
Fast forward 4.5 years to the investigation into Colgan Flight 3407.
Oh yeah, in 6 months' time you'll be upgraded into the Saab and blah blah blah.
The atmosphere in the cockpit is eerily familiar to Tom Houter.
Because of the reaction we saw, it became more important for us to go back on this crew.
Could it be that pilot fatigue had brought down Flight 3407 as well? This time, the detective work falls on NTSB investigator Evan Byrne.
When we looked at the first officer's activities in the days before the flight, one of the most compelling things was that she lived in Seattle, yet she was based in Newark. She commuted on an overnight freight airline to Newark, which required her to fly from Seattle to Memphis, arriving in Memphis early in the morning, switching planes to travel from Memphis to Newark, which arrived about 6:30 in the morning.
First Officer Shaw had a journey to work that took her from coast to coast, across 13 states, covering almost 3,000 miles. Although she manages to get some sleep in the crew lounge at Newark, it's hardly been a restful night.
She wasn't in her own bed. She wasn't at home. She was traveling, and the environment in which she was trying to obtain sleep calls into question how restorative that sleep actually was.
So what about Shaw's co-pilot, Captain Marvin Renslow?
Several days before the accident, Captain Renslow had commuted up to Newark from his home in Tampa and stayed overnight in the crew room on Monday.
Renslow then has 2 long duty days starting at 5:30 a.m. On the eve of the crash, he chooses to spend another night in the crew room, but again, it's not a restful one.
About 3:10 in the morning, the captain logged on to the airline's scheduling system and acknowledged a change in his trip.
He logs on again at 7:26 a.m. Byrne then establishes from witness reports that the captain does not go back to sleep.
About the time of the accident, we estimate that the captain had been awake for approximately 15 hours.
The Colgan pilots had clearly faced an exhausting build-up to their flight. But did this prove they were suffering from fatigue? Or might there be some other explanation? Investigators need to know, what are the typical actions of pilots suffering from fatigue, and did they match those of the Colgan aircrew? The answer to that question would come 15 months later from an event halfway across the world in India. May 2010, and Air India Express Flight 812 from Dubai to Mangalore is nearing its destination. There are 160 passengers on board.
The passengers were primarily Southern Indian, traveling back home, arriving back in Mangalore in the morning, and it was a regular nightly flight. The chocks were off at around 2:30 in the morning, so now they're up, they're away, they're going to Mangalore.
Among them is 48-year-old Mohammed Farouk, taking leave from his job in Dubai to visit his family in India.
It was a very busy flight. I was very much comfortable on that flight.
It's early morning, and among those still asleep is 55-year-old Serbian captain Zlatko Glušica.
Air India Express pilots stated that it was not unusual that they sleep during these night flights. You have a 2-man crew to be able to monitor and support each other. Many airlines have an approved rest period.
As Glušica sleeps, the man in charge is 40-year-old First Officer Harbinder Ahluwalia. He's been with Air India for just over a year.
Express India 812, position.
1 hour before landing, he makes contact with ground control in Mangalore.
Check position.
They're coming in for their reporting point. He asks for a radar identification, and he is told that the radar control is not working.
Because the ground radar isn't working, it means Flight 812 won't be able to start its final approach until it's closer to the airport than normal.
It's just a shorter approach. It's not complicated. It's not a big deal, but it was sprung on him, and he is clearly a little bit uncomfortable with this.
Back in the cabin, the passengers begin to wake from their night in the air.
Everybody was relaxing, and some passengers, they were sleeping. That flight was normal, cabin crew was normal, everything was normal.
Air India Express 812 is now only 80 nautical miles from Mangalore. Only now does the captain awake, with less than 1 hour till touchdown.
This is the weather, Captain. This is a 0.25 DME, then DME to the left. Radar not available.
As they are coming in towards the descent, they should have already discussed their planned approach. They need to make sure they're both on the same page and doing the same thing.
The shorter approach because of the failed radar makes it all the more critical that the descent is properly planned. But Captain Glushitsa hasn't had time to wake up properly. He is in no fit state, but straight away he needs to make decisions.
Up until this point, he has really not taken in what's happening, so this lack of planning becomes an issue as they go into an approach that they're not used to. That is a shorter approach.
Instead of gradually descending, Captain Glushitsa continues to keep Flight 812 high. All the while, time is running out to get the plane on the ground.
He's too high, he's too fast, his rate of descent is too high. Pretty much everything is wrong at this point.
Back in the cabin, the passengers are oblivious to the pilot's shortcomings.
Everybody was fastening their seatbelt, and everybody was ready to land.
Finally, more than 10 minutes after Captain Glushitsa has woken up, Flight 812 starts its descent. Only now, just 2 miles from the runway, does Captain Glushitsa realize that he is still too high. But in his tired state, he takes a series of entirely irrational decisions. First, he increases his rate of descent dramatically. But he's at twice the height he should be to make a safe approach. What's more, this is no ordinary runway. Mangalore has a hilltop landing strip. It's one of the most challenging in India.
It's listed in India as a critical airfield. It's got a shorter than normal overrun, and if you go off that overrun, then you're falling down into a gorge.
But Captain Glushitsa is determined to make the landing.
The first officer is looking out and says,
"It's too high."
The first officer and the plane itself are now warning the captain that his rate of descent is dangerously extreme.
At that point, you'd say, right, okay, I've blown it. I can see the runway beneath me, and you'd break it off. And he didn't. What he did was he disengaged the autopilot so that he could get down faster.
Sink rate. Hold up, sink rate. Hold up, sink rate.
With fatigue clouding his mind, Captain Glushitsa continues with his suicidally steep descent.
There was a noise. Down. It was coming down like this. Normally it comes like this, but it is coming like this. All the passengers, they were screaming.
Flight 812 has begun a kamikaze-style nosedive towards a critical hilltop runway.
Now things are going horribly wrong.
The lives of 166 people are on the line. Having just woken from a 90-minute nap, Captain Zlatko Glushitsa of Air India Express Flight 812 is determined to pull off a death-defying landing on a critical hilltop runway at Mangalore Airport.
They're now getting barked at by the machinery saying, sink rate, pull up, sink rate, pull up.
Sink rate. Pull up. Sink rate. Pull up.
This is a totally unsafe approach, and every bit of this machinery knows it, and the first officer knows it.
Sink rate. Pull up.
But Captain Glushitsa, still confused by the effects of fatigue, refuses to abort the landing.
Pull up. Sink rate. Pull up. Sink rate. Pull up.
Flight 812 is now less than 100 feet above the runway. 166 people on board are only moments away from catastrophe. Among them is Mohammed Farouk.
That flight was going like this. Good, 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 good.
No room, Captain. We don't have room, Captain. Sink rate.
Flight 812 plunges off the end of the hilltop runway and into a ravine below. Both pilots are killed instantly, along with nearly all of their passengers. In total, 158 people have perished. It's the worst loss of life on a 737 in the plane's history. It's astonishing that there are any survivors at all.
It is a miracle. For me, it is a miracle. Before I'm going to bed, every day I think about this incident. It is a grace of God.
The disaster sends shockwaves across India. How could this have happened?
The Mangalore air crash was one of the biggest tragedies to have happened in the Indian aviation scenario. It shook up the authorities, the airline, the passengers. Everybody was questioning, why did it happen?
The National Transport Safety Board in the US are able to recover the recording from the cockpit voice recorder and agree to share this information, to get this information to India under locked and sealed conditions. And they listen to the recording and they're absolutely shocked. One of the American investigators who was helping out said it was the first time they'd heard snoring on a cockpit voice recording and in the history of the NTSB.
It was almost unbelievable. Captain being asleep in a plane, you hadn't heard of such a thing before. You hadn't heard of air crashes being because of captain being asleep in a plane. You always thought they were the people who were most alert, who were better paid, who were given all sorts of facilities just to overcome such type of things and to be much more careful than an ordinary driver on the street.
The investigators found to their surprise that the captain was snoring a lot and that the captain had been asleep for, almost all of the cruise, and he was still asleep when the aircraft should have started its descent. I haven't heard of a case as bad as this one before. I'm not sure that anybody had, and there was a palpable silence at the beginning of the investigation when normally some simple facts would have been released. We were getting nothing. It was almost as if the investigators were looking at this and saying, how are we going to tell the world that this happened? It's ridiculous.
It has been confirmed by the DGC officials here that they have recovered the black box.
In the aftermath, there could be no doubt what the cause of the crash was. The captain had been suffering from so-called sleep inertia, and its signature was a series of utterly irrational decisions. The Air India disaster had shown the world how a pilot drunk with fatigue would act. The question facing the investigators into the Colgan air crash was, could they see the same symptoms of bizarre decision-making in the crew of Flight 3407? If so, then they too had almost certainly been intoxicated by the same deadly brew. As they looked deeper, it was clear that Captain Renslow and First Officer Shaw had faced serious disruptions to their sleep in the hours leading up to the crash.
Oh yeah, in 6 months' time you'll be upgraded into
And just like Captain Gluschitzer and the crew on Corporate Air Flight 5966, they had clearly lost focus during the landing. But were there also telltale symptoms of fatigue? Irrational actions? Tom Houter's team at the NTSB employ a groundbreaking technique in air crash investigation to find out.
Today, with the amount of flight data record information we have, we can provide very accurate simulations, animations of what happened.
Houter observes how the pilots were caught off guard when the stick shaker went off, but at that stage they weren't in any danger.
They were receiving a stall warning when the aircraft wasn't even close to stalling, but they reacted to the stall warning in an unusual way.
To avoid a stall, a pilot should follow a well-established procedure. Simply push forward on the control column. This has the effect of pushing the nose down. With gravity on its side, the aircraft picks up speed and lift and escapes from the stall. But what Captain Renslow did is almost unbelievable.
The captain pulled back on the flight controls. In a time when they needed more airspeed, they reduced airspeed.
Renslow's reaction goes against all his training. And First Officer Shaw makes an equally irrational error.
The first officer retracted the flaps, which made things worse. That reduces lift.
Retracting the flaps is precisely the wrong thing to do.
This is a very fundamental error. You wouldn't even expect it of a student pilot. The reaction was startling, to say the least.
A lack of focus, impaired judgment, illogical reactions. All the hallmarks were there.
Our conclusion was that it was likely that both crew members were likely experiencing the effects of fatigue about the time of the accident, which affected their performance.
The truth is, pilot fatigue has been causing air crashes for over 20 years. But in that time, regulations to deal with it have remained largely unchanged. In December 2011, the US introduced new laws to address flight and duty time regulations for pilots. The industry has finally woken up to the problem of pilot fatigue. But if our skies are going to stay safe, it'll have to remain alert.